Okay, it's Mr. Collins again, and I have figured out the difference between pause and stop, so there will be no sound check this time. Left off talking about how Assyria and Babylonia conquered people and would send people into exile, and that was their way of managing their empires. It only lasted for less than a century. When the Persian Empire came along under Cyrus, his philosophy of running an empire was that you let people live where they want, you let them worship the way they want, you let them have their own identity, and you just make sure that they pay their taxes. And it turned out that Persia was a much more stable empire, lasted for a couple of centuries. And when you think that the United States has been an empire for only about 50 years, these are pretty impressive statistics. Excuse me. All of the empires, the reason why you would run an empire is because you want to make money. You go around beating up little countries and taking their money from them and forcing them to pay tribute or taxes. And so there's always a sense in which somebody else wants to move in and take over your action. So the Assyrians were hot stuff for a while, a Mesopotamian empire, and then the Babylonians took over. And then the Persians came from further east, modern-day Iran, and conquered the Babylonian Empire. But the Persian Empire itself fell to the first of the Western empires that we're going to talk about, which is the Greek Empire. And I'm oversimplifying this, so I'm not going to talk about the Ptolemies and Seleucids, but Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and expanded it even further. Each of these empires was successfully bigger than the one previous to it. And so the Greeks come in about 300 years before Jesus, and they take over the Jews. And the Greeks had a completely different way of running their empire. And I'm actually going to have you turn and start a new page of notes in a minute or two, but let me finish off here because what happens under the Greeks is really important. The Jews actually rebel against the Greek Empire, or rebel against Antiochus Epiphanes about 150 years before Jesus, and there's actually a brief period of Jewish independence from any empire. That it wasn't until you go back to the United Monarchy and the time before the Assyrians came in, centuries before the Jewish people established their own country once again. And that lasted for only about 70, 80 years, and then infighting among the Jewish groups kind of invited the opportunity for the next big empire to come and stomp on Palestine, and that was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire had a different way of running their empire as well. They would find a local person, so somebody like Cleopatra down in Egypt, or somebody like Herod the Great in Palestine, and the Romans would rule through a puppet ruler. They would find somebody locally to impose Roman rule with Roman support and collect taxes for Rome. Excuse me. And it's during the Roman occupation of Palestine that a boy named Jesus is born in the upper region of Galilee by the name of Jesus, and he's going to go on to change the world. So here's the outline of the empires in general: Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And you should know about how they run their empires. You should know how specifically they interacted with the north and the south. And Assyria and Babylon both would send people into exile. Assyria conquered the north, failed to conquer the south. Babylon conquered the south, sent the Jews into exile. Persia allowed the Jews to return from exile and rebuild. And the Romans ruled through a puppet ruler and were in control of Palestine at the time that Jesus was born. So find a new page in your notes and fasten your seatbelts. Okay. Sorry, not sure why that map came up. Hellenization. Big vocab word for you. If you think of Helen of Troy, or the Hellenistic Peninsula, Hellenization, and this is a very, very poor definition, but over the years it seems to work well for students. Hellenization was the attempt of the Greek Empire to Greekify non-Greek people. The Assyrians and Babylonians would control their empire by sending people to different areas and keeping them destabilized and divided. The Persian Empire controlled their people by letting people do basically whatever they wanted to. And the way that the Greeks ran their empire was that they expected everybody in the Greek Empire to adopt Greek language, to study Greek literature and Greek philosophy, and to worship Greek gods and goddesses. So they would build gymnasiums, and if you had Mr. Ward as a teacher, you'd have some humorous times talking about this. They would build gymnasiums as kind of sports programs to invite the young people to come and learn about Greek culture. And I make the joke that if you were on the Greek basketball team, your coach would speak Greek, and when you had snack, you would have Greek food, and before every game, you would pray to the Greek gods. So Hellenization was a way in which the Greeks controlled their empire by imposing their culture, language, and religion on the people they conquered. And in general, this worked well in other places. If you were worshiping Astarte, the goddess of fertility, and the Greeks said, no, you have to worship Aphrodite, you'd be pretty fine with that. Or if you were worshiping Ishtar, the goddess of fertility, and the Greeks told you to worship Aphrodite, you were fine with that. If you worshipped Bel or Baal, the storm god, the thunder and lightning god, and the Greeks wanted you to switch and worship Zeus, that was fine. If you were an Egyptian and you worshipped one of the sun gods like Ra or Aten, and the Greeks told you to worship the sun god Apollo, it wasn't a big switch. But for the Jews who had a real sense of monotheism, the idea of worshiping these foreign gods was completely against everything that they stood for. And so Hellenization did not work well with the Jewish people. There were three basic approaches you could take if you were a Jew living during this time. And these are vocab words. I'm going to give you pretty substantial definitions for them. The stories about this are described in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which I don't think we'll have any time to cover in class this year. But the first group of Jews were those who adopted the Greek religion and adopted Greek culture, and even went so far as to adopt Greek religion. And obviously this had the benefit of getting you the chance to be promoted in the Greek Empire. You would get along just fine, they would welcome you, and you would abandon the Torah, you would abandon the kosher laws, you would abandon the covenant, and you would align yourself with the Greeks. So those were the apostates. The Zealots, and this term is used more precisely later in the New Testament, but in the book of Maccabees it talks about how the family of Mattathias, the Hasmoneans, were very zealous. The word zeal means enthusiasm. Were very zealous for their faith and would not accommodate the Greeks, and they would not adopt their ways. And the Zealots actually led violent rebellions against the Greeks and were successful. The story of Hanukkah comes from the success of the Maccabees actually kicking the Greeks out of Jerusalem and purifying the temple, which had a bunch of Greek gods placed inside of it. So the Zealots were the heroes of the book of Maccabees because they were the ones who took up arms and basically kicked out the Greeks. Ironically and tragically and unfortunately, they then pursued their program further and began to forcibly convert people to Judaism. A place in the south called Idumea, formerly Edom, and a place in the north called Galilee, which you might have heard of before. And people from those regions were forced to become Jews and were not really accepted by mainline Jews in the same way as real Jews, if that makes sense. So the apostates were the ones who went over to Greek culture. The Zealots were the ones who fought against it. And briefly in the book of 1st Maccabees, but more in the book of 2nd Maccabees, they talk about people who were martyred for their faith. the Greek word martyr means witness. And martyrs were people who would not abandon the covenant. They would not bow down and worship the Greek gods. They would not eat pork and the other Greek foods. But they were willing to suffer and die for their religion because that was what was right. And the stories in 2nd Maccabees tell about these families being horribly tortured because they refused to go along with the Greek ways. And there's even one story where a group of Hasidic Jews, or Hasidian Jews, refused to even fight back against the Greeks because it's the Sabbath and they don't want to violate the Sabbath. So these were 3 different distinct ways. And there's an interesting story actually in 2nd Maccabees that talks about this old man who's offered the chance to pretend that he's going along with the Greeks, and he refuses to do it because if he pretends to eat the pork and pretends to bow down to the gods, then he is really an apostate. So I want you to go back to that page that I had you write about the Babylonian exile, because there's one more really distinct change that takes place in the Jewish worldview because of the exile and after the exile. Ancient Judaism, pre-exilic Judaism, tended to believe that God would reward good people in this life, or God would punish bad people in this life, or if the nation was bad, they would be punished in history, or they would be rewarded in history. And this is what's called temporal judgment. The idea that God's rewards come within time. And think about the word temporary for a short time. That if you are a good person, you'll live a long life, you'll be wealthy, and if you're a bad person, you'll get sick and you'll die. And a change that comes about in Judaism after the exile, and most of these changes take centuries, is the idea that maybe God's justice isn't administered in this lifetime. And I go back to what you just wrote about the martyrs, that in the time of the Maccabees, or the time that the Jews were rebelling against the Greeks, if you were a good and faithful Jew, you might be tortured and executed. And if you were a Jew who abandoned your faith, you might get a promotion in the Greek Empire. And to the thinking of the people living at the time, that didn't seem right. So an idea that emerges later in Judaism is the idea of eschatological judgment. And I know that's a big word, but eschatological means the end, or the eschaton means the end. And this is the idea that God will reward us at the end of our life, or God will bring judgment upon the world at the end of time. So corrupt companies or countries or people may not be punished in this lifetime, but at the end of time, God will make everything right. Or good people suffer and die for their faith, or bad things happen to good people. Well, at the end of their life, they'll be rewarded, or at the end of history, they'll be rewarded on a judgment day. And this idea really emerges in the Bible during the time that the Jews are being persecuted by the Greeks. And it's at this point in the Bible, in 2nd Maccabees specifically, but also in the book of Daniel, that the Bible begins talking about life after death and begins talking about resurrection. And the idea of an afterlife, a heaven or a hell, begins to emerge in Jewish thought. And there was some movement towards this in the prophets. You'll read Malachi in class, next class period, and Malachi talks about the coming of the day of Yahweh, the coming of the day of judgment. Ironically, the ability to think about life and rewards at the end of time is something that it actually comes from Babylonian theology and even from Greek philosophy and theology. So even though the faithful Jews rejected the Greek worldview and Greek religion and things like that, this idea of life after death is something which has its origins in Greek philosophy as well. So there's a connection between Hellenization and the emergence of this idea. Not a direct connection, but I hope that makes sense. you are done taking notes, go ahead and stop and rewind if you need to, and I will see you in class. Oops, excuse me. I will see you in class on Tuesday and Wednesday.